Hey guys, welcome back to Crusade Against Ignorance. Today, we're going to be talking about socialism. Well, as we'll see, not really. We're going to be talking about what Trent Horn thinks are some objections to socialism, but either aren't actually or are just really bad. Um, so I figured it'd be worthwhile to engage Trent Horn on this because he's a pretty popular Catholic apologist. He's recently written a book on why Catholics can't be socialists, and of course, I'm not super interested in the theological side of that, not being a Catholic myself, but I am interested in arguments against socialism, especially popular ones that are influential, say, amongst, younger people trying to get into philosophy that may look up to Horn and, think he's got some good arguments. Socialism, I want to show that he does not, in fact, have anything like that. If it seems like I'm rushing through points, it's because this is my third go at recording this video. I have had some technical difficulties the last two tries, so let's just jump right into it and see what he has to say, and I'll provide some commentary along the way.
Here's a question then. How can you explain to someone that socialism or communism is evil, as opposed to just arguing that it doesn't work? And is that something you would want to argue for?
Well, if you'll notice in the case that I made against Sam in my debate, I gave not just what the church teaches, but I gave principled reasons. I gave 5 of them in my debate as to why the church teaches good Catholics cannot be true socialists. And so when you go to
keep note of that word there, true socialists, what he means by that, because at no point in this video does he ever actually mention socialism. It's kind of interesting. So,
Rerum Novarum, Pope Leo XIII, he does make a practical argument. He does say, look, if you implement true socialism, he actually seems to allude to Adam Smith, who is the founding father of modern economics. So, excuse me here. Smith, what Leo seems to allude to is Leo says that the sources of wealth would run dry, that if you took away the ability to innovate, to reinvest capital, to grow businesses, no one would ever invest in that. The sources of wealth would run dry. There would be envy. There would be discord. And so Leo talks about how people...
well, the funny thing is, first of all, right-wingers and conservatives, but right-wingers more broadly, love to cite Adam Smith when talking about socialism and economics at all. I mean, Adam Smith was in stark disagreement to them on a lot of things. He completely recognized the tendency towards capitalists to be corrupt. He also endorsed a form of the labor theory of value, which is most popularly, employed by or implemented by Marxists. So people like to talk a lot about Adam Smith without really knowing much of what Adam Smith actually said. But also, there is an entire school of socialist thought called market socialism, so it's unclear what he's talking about here with, like, oh, the sources of wealth would run dry, business transactions. No, I mean, if you watch my video earlier in this channel with Dustin Crummett, or familiar at all with socialist thought, there is an entire socialist school of thought that is fine with having markets as a means of allocating resources and actually advocates having markets as the means of allocating resources, just without capitalist ownership and control of major means of production, which is the actual demarcation between capitalists and socialists. So this kind of economic argument is just confused as to what it's actually arguing against. If you're arguing against some sort of like central planning or Keynesianism, fine. We can have that discussion maybe more empirically than ideologically, but as it stands, it's nothing to do with socialism.
People would all be brought down to one dead level. But the argument that he makes is a principled one. And I put it very bluntly in the debate. I said, look, it's wrong to steal other people's stuff just because you think you will be better off. You can't do that. It's a sin. You can't steal something that belongs to someone else.
Oh, okay. This is where the video starts to go even more so off the rails, and he'll build on this more later, and his case just gets more confused as he goes on talking. So he's saying, socialism's evil, or the real problem with socialism, I guess, looking at the title here, is that it's wrong to steal, and socialism somehow entails stealing because you think it'll make you better off. I mean, for one thing, there's obviously just the case of like, okay, what about, not making myself better off, making others better off? But of course, he's not really even explained what he means by stealing. Does he mean taxation? Because later in the video, he doesn't actually say taxation's in principle wrong. So he's saying he's making a principled argument, but he's really not. So So sure, in some cases it's wrong to steal, but it's not wrong in every case, right? Obviously, like if there's like a rich family that has an overabundance of food and they're having like a dinner party, and I sneak in and steal like a loaf of bread from them to feed to like my starving child, and that's the only way I can like save my child. Like, that's stealing technically, but it's not wrong. This is the problem with all the taxation is theft arguments from libertarians too. When you make it not question begging, if you don't build wrongness into the definition of theft and you just start talking about stealing, then there's clear counterexamples. It's obviously not wrong to steal in some cases. So again, and again, he's not even talking about socialism. He's talking about like a certain kind of egalitarianism about distributive justice or redistributive justice. And there are, he never really attacks the foundations for why people think that, say certain social programs that are publicly funded are justified, like some kind of like Rawlsian contractarian view. There's actually a coherent view as to why the state can reallocate your resources. But as it stands, for one, he's not saying anything actually about socialism, and for another, it's important to note it's not wrong to steal in every case. And you can also do the thing of like, weighing values. So maybe stealing, even if stealing is wrong, maybe it's less wrong than letting people die of preventable diseases or letting them die because they don't have adequate access to care. So it's fine to play the weighing values game, but the way people should respond to this should be on breaking down the logic of what he's actually saying, and it doesn't at all follow. So a lot of what he's going to talk about here is addressed by Dustin Crummett and I in our recent video on the case for socialism, but let's keep going here.
Just because you think you will be better off. That is the sin of socialism. It's theft. And so I put forward that Leo puts forward in Rerum Novarum 15 through 17. He makes an argument for private property. And what he means by private property...
Sorry, real quick to jump back in here. It's also worth pointing out that socialism doesn't directly entail anything about stealing or even imply it. I mean, socialism, again, is about, and he's about to talk about private property here, but he doesn't actually use this correctly, as we'll see. But the difference between socialism and capitalism is about ownership and control of major means of production. That's what private property means in the sense that's kind of important to political philosophy. But again, socialism just says the workers should own and control major means of production. I'm not sure what he's said at all has to do with that, and the reason I'm not sure is because it has nothing to do with it.
Property is not just personal property, things that we consume. He makes the point, it's this. We are different than, how are we different than animals? I mean, think about this. We eat, we need shelter, we need to reproduce. So we're similar with animals in a lot of ways. So if that's the case, then the only thing we would have a right to as human beings, if we have a right to these things, would just be access to them, not ownership. So it'd be like saying, okay, Matt, you and your family, you need to eat, you need to be fed, go down to the watering hole, like in The Lion King. We're all going to walk down to the watering hole, get our drink, and then head back. But Leo says we're not animals. Because we don't merely just eat and...
Well, we are animals, biologically speaking. That's all we are. We're primates. We're biological organisms like everything else. I mean, this isn't really a super important point about socialism or about anything at all, really. But it would not at all follow from the fact that we are animals, because, just as a basic level of biological taxonomy, we are. It doesn't follow from that we wouldn't have the right to, own certain things. That we may need use of, but it's interesting he doesn't go into much here. What about, say, there's also the case of how did I word this before? You may need perpetual access to something, but that doesn't entail logically that you have to own it. So say, for example, I need to use a book for like a final research paper, and I need to like have access to this book over the course of like a month. But it's too expensive for me to buy. Well, I go to a library, once or twice a week and read it and do research on it for this finals paper I'm writing. If I need perpetual access to something that doesn't directly entail that I have to own it privately, there could be public means of providing a service or good that would be, consistent with my right to perpetually need to make use of some resource. So what he's saying here doesn't follow from the fact that we're animals, that we don't have kind of rights to perpetually use things, but also even if we do have the right to perpetually use or consume certain goods or resources, it doesn't follow from that we have to own them privately, at least not in every case. So again, this isn't still nothing to do with socialism, but just some interesting points about ownership.
And drink and wander from place to place. We plan our lives out.
Mm-hmm.
We plan and we pursue goods beyond merely surviving. And we then allocate goods to those we care about, like our children, and we support them. So in order to do that, in order to make use of our rational mind to be able to do that, we have to not just be able to use things that support us, but own them. We have to have ownership over them to say they are.
So on that point there, I just recall everything I just said, that we must own them doesn't follow, at least not for everything, right? Because if what Horn's saying here is taken to be like some sort of universal maxim, it just doesn't work. So it doesn't follow logically from what he said that we have to privately own everything. I already went over this point, kind of anticipating this, but just keep that in mind as he talks here.
Ours, and we are able to use them for our benefit and the benefit of those who are related to us, either familially or through a commercial relationship, like those who labor for us.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why Leo says that this is a right that is rooted in natural law. It comes from our human nature. It's not something the state lets us have private property at its graces.
So
we have a right to this.
That is interesting there, because if his entire case is premised on natural law, I mean, that's kind of a controversial theory in ethics. And a particularly Catholic spin on natural law is even more controversial. So I'm not taking it to mean that his entire case rests on that. But, if it does, then it's kind of problematic to, have your entire case be premised on this super controversial, or at least partially controversial, metaphysical / meta-ethical view. But that's just kind of a side note. I don't think the case he's trying to make rests on natural law. You can make kind of just a non-natural law rights-based argument in the vein of someone like Robert Nozick. But, I don't think he's conceding that, but just an interesting point to note.
And to take it away from the ability to be able to support ourselves and force us to be dependent upon the state instead is a grave injustice.
So if socialism is evil because it essentially steals things and redistributes them, and
Right.
there are kind of differing degrees of socialism, depending on how you use the term, in different countries. Like I'm thinking of Australia. I was just looking up tax.
All right, sorry to stop again so soon, but we're about to go down a rabbit hole of a mess here and what he's about to talk about. I've had to sit through this video like twice already, so I know. But just as what he said there, nothing in socialism entails total dependence on the state, and nothing in egalitarianism about redistributive justice. There's no kind of Rawlsian view even would say that we have to be dependent on the state for everything. So his point there about like forcing people to be dependent to the state is sort of just like a false dichotomy, because as I said, there are lots of things like libraries and other instances we can think of where there are publicly funded goods and such, but that doesn't make us completely dependent on the state. So that doesn't make any sense, but we're about to go down much more of a mess here, so...
Tax rates the other day in Australia. As soon as you start making over a certain amount of money, you get taxed a heck of a lot more there than you do here. So could you just complain, well, that's also theft?
Right, and Sam brought this up in the debate about paying taxes. The taxes are not theft.
Right.
And my reply would be, some tax rates are not theft, but others are. So just because something becomes evil in degree, there are some things that are intrinsically evil, like abortion is, just evil, for example. But there are other things that come evil in degree.
Okay, well, for one thing, no. We're going to be doing a whole separate video, or maybe series of videos responding to Horn and others on abortion. But he'll talk about this a little more, so he can just expound his case. But if he's not saying that taxation's wrong in principle, he said earlier he was making a principled argument, and the principled argument had something to do with, socialism requires that we steal from people, or the state steals from people and gives it to other people. And so if he's not saying taxation's wrong in principle, it's hard to see how he's actually making a principled argument. And he doesn't actually give us the cutoff, the line at which taxation becomes wrong. Like, it's generally okay, but, at like 50% rate, then it's wrong. And he doesn't talk about, like, is a certain, like, tax rate wrong, or, like, a certain amount, like a flat rate. It has to all be a flat rate. So it's imprecise, but also, given what he said earlier, you would think he was kind of making almost this libertarian-style argument that taxes are, in principle, wrong. I think I already gave a couple reasons to think that's not the case, but I'm going to go in more in depth to that in another video. But it's kind of, his case gets confused even more so here, because it becomes unclear what he's actually arguing. Because if he's not arguing in principle that taxation and reallocation of your resources by the state is wrong, so he's not arguing then if he's fine with taxation up to a certain point, then to an extent he's okay with the state reallocating your money and your resources and capital, etc. So he's not in principle against that. And I'm sure he's isn't. I don't think he'd be maybe against that for, like, say, the military or police. So what is he against it for things like universal health care? Is it what the taxes are used for that makes it wrong? That's not what he's saying. He's saying just at a point it becomes wrong. But he never gives us that cutoff point. And if you're saying stealing's in principle wrong, but taxation's not intrinsically wrong, then it's not intrinsically stealing. So his case is getting more and more confused by the second. And we're 4 minutes in, still nothing said about socialism.
So, for example, this is, works well with the current news that is happening. When an officer uses force to subdue a suspect, that is not intrinsically evil. So if an officer just put his hand on a suspect's shoulder and said, firmly on this shoulder, and said, I'm going to recommend that you just calm down for a minute. He's using force. Let's say he's pressing down on the shoulder, not breaking his clavicle, but he's just, how it is. Someone might do that, like letting you know, I got force here, buddy, but I'm not going to use it, like in a well-natured way. We would say that's not evil.
Right.
But if he were to lean his knee on the person's neck and asphyxiate him to death, that would clearly be evil. So force would be something that becomes evil in degrees. That clearly there's force that's not evil. So you couldn't say, because there's some force that's not evil, I can use any force I want. That doesn't follow at all. It'd be the same thing with taxes. Because there's some taxes I can levy that are not evil, I could levy any tax I want. It doesn't follow from there either. That would be the same mistaken view. So Leo talks about this in Rerum Novarum. That's why he says the state can regulate private property. So when people, I'm actually going to respond to a Marxist soon who is critiquing my book, who claims
that's going to be absolutely hysterical to see, because, dude, you don't even know what socialism is. There's no way you're going to be even close on Marxism. And by the way, he's going to talk a little bit here about, like, the state repurposing property and all that. No socialist is a monarchist that thinks that, the state just has this sovereign right and owns everything, and anything people own is just at the good graces of the state. That's not the view at all that really any socialist or even kind of broadly egalitarian person or philosopher would take. I mean, again, there was entire, the main current in anarchist thought throughout history has been socialist, especially like in, say, the syndicalist tradition or mutualist, which is kind of more close to what that market socialism like I was talking about earlier. So socialism doesn't intrinsically have anything to do with this kind of like pro-government, big government, or even government at all view. It's sort of separate from that. A lot of, contemporary socialists are fine ideologically with using the state to reallocate resources via taxation or something. But socialism intrinsically does not have any sort of ideological or theoretical commitments to being, authoritarian or pro-government. So, of course, no socialist is going to say that the state can, take 100% of your property at will, and that's fine. I mean, that's just sort of absurd.
Claim that I argue for an absolute right to private property. I do not. That's a common straw man of the position I'm arguing for, which is the idea that you have your property is yours and no one can ever take it away from you for any reason whatsoever. That is not a position I endorse. It's not a position the church endorses, because property belongs to God. Made the earth for everyone.
Right.
But it doesn't keep us from owning parts of it. So
this is interesting, actually. This goes back to a theological point Dustin Crummett made. It's also kind of worth pointing out that private property regulations, laws, and private property itself is sort of kind of instantiated and enforced by the state and by laws. There are kind of like regulations and laws in place to kind of protect people's private property rights. So it's not as if historically private property rights, at least in the United States, have ever existed separate from kind of this parasitic relationship on the state protecting them. That's kind of always how private properties work. Private property in the sense Horn's talking about. Private property in the capitalist socialist debate is about, whether or not private entities, say like, just sole business owners or corporate entities can own and control major means of production. That's what capitalism, socialism, in that debate, what means of production refers to. And that's not what he's talking about here, because he's not even talking about socialism yet, but that theological point that Dustin Crummett made, not in our most recent video, but in the first video I did with him on leftism and Christianity, was actually that there's this kind of, a lot of the early church fathers actually had this argument that people who hoard resources are stealing, because God, kind of like what Trent's saying here, God has provided adequate resources for everybody to live lives of at least adequate flourishing. So if anybody has an excess amount of money and is keeping it from the poor, and there are poor that are suffering, then those that are hoarding money are the ones that are actually stealing. So it's actually theft to hoard wealth. And as Dustin says in my video with him, even if you don't accept kind of the theological implications of that, of God having this sort of preordained allocation of resources, even if you don't accept that theological baggage, the point being made there at a political level is an interesting one and probably a good one. So let's see what this is.
Aquinas says is that because God made the earth for everyone, you have a right to other people's goods in cases of necessity.
That's
so
right.
If you're in a, if you're lost in the woods and you're starving to death and you come across someone's summer cabin that they're not using right now, and you break in to get out of the blizzard and feed yourself until you're rescued, that would not be theft. That would be
okay. I'm glad he mentions that and brings it up. That's the same kind of thought experiment Dustin used when I talked to him. But also then it raises the interesting question of, well, what then counts as cases of necessity, as he puts it? Like, are children in third world countries dying of preventable diseases from, like, say, malaria? Is that not a necessary case? Are people dying because they don't have adequate access to health care here in the U.S. not a necessary case? Is people having to regulate insulin and therefore dying because the prices are jacked up by pharmaceutical companies? Is that not a necessary case? Like, if preventing death is not a necessary case, then what is, right? Like in this example he's giving. So kind of arguing for this view that property is the primary thing is sort of going to run into all these problematic ethical cases. But then it raises all these questions like, well, what then is a necessary case then, Horn? Is, obviously you're probably not for universal health care. So, what's a necessary case if not providing people adequate access to clean food, water, housing, medical care, and all that? I mean, if that's not necessary, then what the hell is?
Under the duty to protect life and the universal destination of goods. Now, you couldn't say, this person doesn't have a right to this cabin because we could use it to house people that are homeless in this county and take it from that person. That would be wrong. That would be an abuse of their property.
Right, but what if those people were going to die? And in order to prevent their death, you had to infringe on somebody's right to maybe come out to their summer cabin and get drunk. Like, really? Like, you're going to say that would be wrong? Like, if these people are going to die and you can prevent their deaths by infringing on, say, a wealthy person's property rights to have, use their summer home, you're going to say that's wrong? Really?
Property that they're using either personally as a summer getaway or in a private means. So I never say private property is absolute, and it can be regulated for the common good. But just because it can be doesn't mean, we'll throw all the rules out the window and the government says exactly what you can do. So Leo makes the point. He says private property can be regulated for the common good, but the state may not absorb it altogether.
Gotcha.
And so it would be an injustice, I quoted this in the debate, for the state to assume all of people's properties through taxes. So just to use 100% tax rate.
Gotcha.
To say, you worked, we'll take that now, and we'll redistribute it. Leo is very clear. The worker has a right to his wages and to dispose of them at his leisure. And now some people, Matt, I don't mean to go on and on. I guess.
Well, then be a Marxist, dude. If you think the worker has a right to his wages, then get on board with anti-capitalism. Kind of being facetious there. But as far as what he said about the 100% absorption and all, I just refer to what I said a couple minutes ago about socialists in the state.
So much here. Some people will say, but the encyclicals say that, what you have that is superfluous, what you don't need to support yourself belongs to the poor.
Yes.
That's true. It's a moral duty. We have a moral duty to support the poor. But Leo even says that one may retain income, not just for subsistence, but he says to keep up life becomingly. Mm-hmm. So you don't have to live in an empty house with like folding chairs.
Right, and no socialist, because again, he's still not said anything about socialism yet in this video, but even no, Rawlsian liberal or egalitarian about redistributive justice is going to say you have to like live in a shack, and that's the only. I mean, that's not the view at all. But he said something else there that I wanted to talk about. I can't remember what it was though, so let me just keep going here.
You can live a life that is becomingly, but with recognition of the moral duty you have to the poor. And so what Leo says is that
sorry, that's what I was going to say. So think about, I say in Peter Singer's book, the life you can save. Sure, you can like live in a house with furniture. Nobody's going to deny that. But when you have like billionaires out here that are buying like, $46 million mansions, and that's like their fourth or fifth house, or buying multiple like gold-plated toilet seats, that's superfluous beyond a degree. Like those people should be taxed at a higher rate. And of course, the say Bernie Sanders tax plan would not deprive Jeff Bezos of his his private jets and all that. But yeah, of course, having, middle class workers having access to like plumbing and electricity and furniture in their house, that's not wrong. But if you're like a billionaire or multimillionaire and you're buying like your 10th gold plated toilet seat, that's superfluous, right? And there should be something in place to prevent just this kind of excessive use of wealth for no good reason when people are dying from preventable causes.
Dispersal of the superfluous income is a matter of Christian charity. It is not a matter of human law, because
it's one thing to tell individual people to feed the poor. It's another thing to tell governmental officials to steal from everybody in order to try to rectify the inequality.
Okay, well, individuals are only so effective at doing this, right? Like governments are instantiated to work on, and kind of work at problems on a national scale. So telling individuals to be charitable is not going to work insofar as it's not going to be able to handle nationwide problems. You also have to understand the point they're making here. They're saying it's a matter of Christian charity. Well, we live in a religiously pluralistic world, and especially here in the United States, a religiously pluralistic nation. So not every person in the United States is a Christian or, adheres to this particular view of Christian charity. So maybe you have this view, Horn, and that's great. Like if you're going to go out and, kind of give, volunteer at homeless shelters, give people money, that's awesome. Good on you. I hope you're doing that. But to say that that is like the only justifiable way, or the only, kind of morally good way to handle like problems like poverty is just, it's just nothing. It's absurd. Like it's just a fantasy, right? Like for one thing, again, not everybody is going to have this Christian charity. So how do you deal with the giant part of the population that doesn't have Christian moral views? How do you, how do you provide for needs of people that are beyond the scope of this individualism, right? So, I mean, governments are instantiated to solve problems on larger scales. That's why we have a government, why we have a federation. And I'm not a pro-government person generally. I'm a libertarian socialist. I'm kind of an anarchist in a Chomskyan vein. So I'm the farthest thing from pro-government. But this is just really horrible logic, like saying that Christian charity compels us to be charitable, and this is the only thing that should be in place to handle like nationwide poverty and nationwide structural economic problems. Like that's just like an half-baked, I don't know what else to call it other than a fantasy.
Bodies.
Right, or to have the government, not even, it would be stealing, but to have the government enforce our moral obligation to help the poor. Because Aquinas makes it very clear that the government does not enforce all of our moral obligations, if in doing so it makes a greater evil. That's why he infamously, Aquinas, allowed for the legality of prostitution.
Right.
Because he believed that if you made it illegal, following Augustine, the world would convulse in lust, and it would be... So, of course, to take from that... So when I see people saying from this, oh, look at this, we have the strong moral duty, so the state should compel us to do that. Well, Aquinas would say we have not just a strong moral duty, but an absolute moral duty not to frequent prostitutes. Not even that we have a stronger duty to not avail ourselves of prostitutes than we do to give to the poor. But even there, Aquinas did not argue for the state to be involved. Now, today, we have the benefit of more empirical knowledge to know about the relevant harms that come from prostitution and the sex trade. And so
we also have the empirical knowledge to know that the private charity bullshit doesn't work.
We do not create greater evils in making it illegal, though we can, of course, prudentially disagree about how to implement these laws. And the same comes with the distribution of wealth.
Thank you for watching.
All right, there it is, folks. Trent Horn's The Real Problem with Socialism. A full 9 minutes of an argument against socialism on moral principles that had nothing to do with moral principles and nothing to do with socialism. again, I didn't want to address this video because I thought it would be good. I've seen some of Horn's stuff around the internet before on politics, and so I knew it wasn't going to be good. I knew it was actually going to be pretty damn bad. Um, but again, since he's sort of such an influential figure, especially amongst young Catholics, I want to make it clear that this is a person who has absolutely no clue what he's talking about when it comes to socialism or politics more broadly. And, given how much he blunders here in terms of not even understanding what he's talking about at a basic terminological level, I'm very skeptical that he has anything interesting or forceful to say about abortion or the existence of God or any other philosophy he kind of dips his toes into. Again, the real astonishing thing about this is nothing was actually said about socialism. As I've stressed in videos before, almost every conservative who argues against socialism that you find on the internet is not even talking about socialism. I've talked about the definition a little bit here and in past videos a lot. So it's almost like shocking that this guy published a book and is kind of getting such an online audience arguing against socialism when he's not even talking about socialism. Like, if you read his book, he even has the section where he gives the age-old right-winger argument about the Nazis being socialists. This is a person who just has absolutely zero clue what's going on in the contemporary political philosophy world. Like, this is just not a position or an argument that's taken seriously by political philosophers at all, nor should it be, because it's not even targeting any view that anybody holds or saying anything. You'll notice as he talked here, nothing he said was actually against. Nobody actually holds the views he was arguing against. No socialist is like a monarchist that thinks the government absolutely owns all property and can just repurpose it on the entirety of what you own at will. Like, nobody thinks that. Nobody thinks every person, every citizen should be made 100% dependent on government such that they can't, like, make money for themselves. And nobody holds the positions that Horn's arguing against. So he has no clue what he's talking about. That much is very obvious, at least on this topic. And you know what? Maybe this was just a bad moment, and I should be more charitable, and I'll check out some of his other videos. So if he's got some more substantial stuff on this, send that my way. I'll definitely take a look at it, and if I need to do multiple videos on this guy on this topic, I'll be happy to do that because it's worth crusading against ignorance. That's what my channel's here to do, and this is a profound level of ignorance about a relatively simple topic. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and sign off here. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video. Have a good one.